Hi, I'm Holly Stone and I'm a clinical solution-focused hypnotherapist with a specialist interest in supporting our teens and families of. It wasn't, I suppose, maybe necessarily what I set out to do many years ago when I started as a therapist, but over the years, and maybe because I'm a mum of two teens myself, who've been through our own issues over the last few years, I have developed a specific interest. And one of the things that I feel incredibly passionate about is being able to share my knowledge and the understanding of how our brains work in helping us to see where a lot of the behaviours and problems and worries come from. Because often the problems that we are seeing in our teens are quite naturally driven, but the behaviours themselves then become the problem, which fuel more of the same, and we can get very stuck. So what I'm hoping to achieve today in sharing this with you is to glean a little bit of understanding into how our brains work, how they perceive the external world, what default networks there are going on in there, and how, most importantly, we can support our teens through these incredibly challenging times that all of us have faced. But I think particularly for our children, this last year and a half with COVID has been extraordinary. And hopefully you'll glean some understanding as to really maybe why things have been quite so tricky for them. So the reason I'm doing this, as I said, is because I think it might help. I hope it helps. I'm also thanking you for your donations that help to support the Hope Charity Project, a passionate project that I'm involved with, where we're a local charity supporting families with issues around mental health, and something that I think is very, very pertinent at the moment. So understanding is key in my mind, and I hope that this will better equip you to support yourselves and your families through these incredibly unique and quite interesting, the word I use, times. So without further ado, I'm going to share some slides which hopefully will support me in what I'm saying. And if you have any questions at any point, do send me a message to my email and I'll do my best, very best to answer those for you. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I hope to help you to understand the adolescent brain, recognize the behaviors of our adolescents and maybe see where they're coming from, and hopefully allow us to see what techniques we can support them with to give them their own empowerment to help them overcome some of the issues that they face. And we'll even touch on how we can use this knowledge to enhance their performance and their feelings of well-being. So to start with, I'm going to share one of my favourite clips, which I share with teens when I'm introducing this knowledge to them, because it's a very negative world that we live in. Everything from marketing campaigns to social media to the news. We know that negativity sells, and I think our younger audience could be led to believe that the world is a very negative place and that they also are not in a very positive position, whereas this video, I think, will give them hope. They always come away feeling far more hopeful because they're blooming brilliant, and the adolescent brain is blooming brilliant. There's so much going on in there, and when they can see what's happening and see what potential they've got, then I hope this offers a little bit of positive light. So without any further ado, I will see if I can make this work. I am not particularly capable when it comes to technology, but let's see how we go.
The adolescence period is absolutely amazing. People often give it a negative approach, saying, oh, it's a time where adolescents are going to lose their mind, or they're just immature, or raging hormones drive them crazy. These are all not only wrong, but they're myths that mislead us and actually disempower us. Whether we're adults or adolescents, they actually give us the wrong message and they make it so there's nothing we can do. So what is actually the truth? The truth is that instead of raging hormones, what's happening is we have remodeling in the brain. in ways we never could have predicted. We now understand two big things are happening in the brain, things you as an adult can support adolescents in developing well. And if you're an adolescent, you actually can use this to help your brain grow in an optimal way. What are those two things? The brain is pruning itself. So imagine that in childhood, you're growing like a tree and establishing all these branches and all these leaves are growing. And the brain, that means connections among the basic cells and neurons, called synapses, are being established. And you're still seeing the knowledge of the world, and that's beautiful. The tree is just growing, growing, growing. Then what happens, to surprise everyone, is the brain begins to prune itself. You start carving away some of those leaves, some of the smaller branches, even some of the larger branches. And the reason for the pruning is to specialize the brain. While the child is developing in ways that are really generalized, learning everything they can about everything they can, an adolescent is going to begin to find their passions, to actually find things they like, things they really love doing, and to drive their development in that way. So pruning is actually a use it or lose it principle underneath it. That if you don't use something, you're going to lose it. So if you like sports or like dancing or like music, do those things so you continue to establish those circuits. The second thing that happens in the remodeling adolescent brain is myelin formation. Myelin is a healthy sheath that allows connected neurons to communicate with each other in a much more effective way. How? It's 100 times faster, the signal that's sent down a neuron to communicate with another neuron, 100 times faster, and after it fires off, it's 30 times shorter the resting period that happens. 30 times 100 is 3,000. So when you put down myelin, you've made your neurons communicate 3,000 times more effectively. That's a great thing. Now, the great thing too is that you as an adolescent can actually use the focus of your attention to be aware of your emotions, aware of other people, be engaging in activities, to be doing things with your thoughts that actually reinforce the parts of your brain you want to hold on to. So the good news about the remodeling story is that a field called neuroplasticity, how the brain responds to experience, shows us that what you do with your mind can change the activity and therefore the structure of your brain. So if you then come up with the statement that the ultimate goal of brain remodeling is to make an integrated brain, to differentiate areas, that's the pruning, and myelinate them, that's the linkage. When you increase differentiation and linkage, you make the brain more integrated. And an integrated brain is the pathway toward well-being. And you can do mind-sight exercises. These are exercises that increase insight, empathy, and integration. And if you do them as an adolescent and also do them as an adult, you'll actually increase the integration of your brain as your brain is growing, not just during adolescence, but throughout the lifespan. And what's the outcome of integration? When integration is made visible, it's kindness and compassion. And so what we see through adolescent development is that our relationships become built on connections that are deep and filled with honoring each other's vulnerability, that's kindness, and supporting connections that are compassionate, filled with a sense of caring about other people and wanting to help them. This is the kind of world we can build as we move through life and support each other in our development.
Lovely video there that I think, as I say, when I share it with the teenagers, they actually quite enjoy that too. So let's move on and look at actually what goes on inside this wonderful brain of ours. And it helps us to understand sometimes where some of these behaviors come from, you know, where when our children are angry and frustrated or upset, and the wonderful word of anxious. And so many clients that I have nowadays between the ages of 11 and 18 come in and I ask them what the problem is and they say, I'm anxious or I have anxiety. Gosh, and why? Where do they learn these words and where does it come from? Well, probably from us as parents. But let's look at where it really comes from and let's see if we can understand a little bit more about anxiety and anger and low mood and really hopefully give you an insight as to how our brains actually perceive this crazy world that we're currently living in. So for the purposes of the work that I do, I spend the majority of my time focusing on two key areas, as you will see here on this slide. One that I call the intellectual mind, the part of our mind that we use to interact with the world around us. And when we're in that part of our mind, we're being true to ourselves and authentic. And even if the world around us is crazy, the decisions that we make when we're in our intellectual mind are ones that we can feel comfortable and pleased with at that moment in time, and they allow us to move forward. But there's another part to our brain that I spend an awful lot of time working with, and I call that the primitive mind, and you'll start to see why. And that's because these two parts of our brain work in very, very different ways. And I would probably say at the moment in time, there's probably the biggest disparity between these two operational parts of our mind, in that we expect ourselves to live the way that we live with the pressures that we face with electricity, exams, schooling, careers, you name it, all of those things that we are currently striving towards. Versus this primitive health and safety part of the brain, which sole use is to ensure our survival. And they work in very different ways. So the primitive mind is incredibly straightforward in its operation. And as we go through these slides, you're going to see, actually, I hope, where anxiety, anger, and depression come from, and start to understand them from a survival point of view. So let's imagine that wherever you are now, you come face to face with a terrifying, ferocious animal, I don't know, polar bear, grizzly bear, something like that. What would happen? Well, first off, your intellectual mind, this part up here, would become impaired. It would stop working. So you'd struggle to think straight because your primitive mind would be taking over. It would be kicking into action to work out very, very quickly the best route out of that problem. Would it be to run faster than you've ever run before, or get out the window quicker than you've ever got out of a window? Would it be to fight it so to become super strong? Or would it be best actually to just hide and wait until that problem's gone away? Now, some of you may have heard of fight, flight, freeze response. That's kind of what I'm talking about here, but we've just given them new labels now. We now call them anxiety, anger, and depression. So anxiety is our primitive mind's response to a problem, any problem. And when it is activated, what the brain is saying is we need to run away from this problem. And you'll probably see this in younger children who, just act impulsively. They get scared or something happens they don't like. Their primitive brain is instantly there and they run away. Likewise, occasionally the odd punch can be thrown. And as we know, that continues throughout. And again, that's aggression, and that frustration is the primitive mind trying to help us with the problem. Now, remembering that all the time that the primitive mind is active, to a greater or lesser extent, the intellectual mind is there or not. So we're not giving excuses here, but when somebody genuinely says they don't remember or they're not sure why they did what they did, we have to kind of really respect that, because they probably don't. And I'm sure there are times that you would also be able to relate to yourselves where, when you reflect back on a moment, you think, well, actually, I wouldn't have said that. That was very out of character, or I really can't remember doing that. And that's purely because of this difference in how our brain actually perceives and responds to our own problems. So I'm going to introduce a simple analogy here, and this really, really helps our children and ourselves to recognize these behaviors and be able to help to solve them. So the primitive mind, as I say, is there to ensure survival, but there's certain limiting factors to its ability to do so. And as I said, we will look at them in slightly more detail as we go through. But I'm going to introduce you to my chimp, for fear of you leaving this presentation at this point. The chimp is the metaphor for the primitive mind. He's well-meaning, he wants to ensure our survival, and you know, he's got all the best intentions in the world. But when we have a problem in any, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, this is what happens. Mind is busy. It becomes difficult for us to focus on anything else other than that activity that's going on there. So to ask the child to continue to communicate when they are facing their own problem can, for them, be a very, very difficult thing to do. So I had an example of this not so long ago, because our interpretation and creation of problems can be as subtle as how we talk about things. So I had a client, a new client not so long ago, who was expecting, understandably, as we all do to a certain extent, their daughter at the age of 14 to be able to reason with the chimp when the chimp was active, trying to help the daughter with her problems. And it's a little bit like trying to calm that child in the candy store when it's got its heart set on the sweets that we're saying no to. It's very difficult. So in this situation, my client, who was 14, was incredibly worried and anxious about homework and not getting it done on time and not getting it done to the best of her ability, all sorts of actually intellectually not really very relevant thinkings, but her primitive mind was really set on homework being a problem. And the mum, in trying to help, had actually said, so what's the worst that could happen? Now, I know I've done this myself in the past, and it's a very British thing to do, isn't it? You know, we assume the worst case scenario and then are pleasantly surprised when it doesn't actually come to fruition quite as badly. But if we remember the chimp focuses on the subject matter of what we're thinking and what we're doing. And in that case, we have just highlighted a problem and made it even worse, so the chimp maintained its activity. So possible problems for our adolescents are huge. A problem's only a problem if it's a problem. And we'll have seen this hugely over the last few months, won't we? Some have thrived throughout lockdown and found it incredibly positive experience. Others have really struggled, and we've seen a huge increase in the number of problems that we face. Now, I put a slight caveat on this. Is it that the number of problems have increased because of lockdown? Maybe, and you can make reach your own conclusions when you've seen the rest of this. Or it could be that as parents, we've been present more because we've all been there together. So have we noticed it more, and has it been highlighted? I don't know the answer to that. The media would have us believe that it's all incredibly bad. Maybe not. Maybe we've just been more aware because we've been present more and we've noticed it. So we need to be really careful with our teens and our younger audience that we don't create problems for them that aren't already there. An example that you may or may not have experienced yourself is watching your younger child balancing along a narrow wall very, very competently, you know, brilliantly, in fact, not a wobble, until we say, be careful that you don't fall. And in doing so, we've planted that seed of doubt and ignited their activity in their primitive mind. They lose concentration, they wobble, and they fall. Case in point, I know I've done that. And one of my colleagues shared on a chat group that I'm on this last week that they had been approached by the parent of a teen girl who'd been told so much about mental illness and what to look out for in school, raising awareness that she was now extraordinarily anxious that she would lose control of her mental health. So she was in fact becoming anxious about becoming anxious. So we need to be mindful of that. We need to recognise that a problem is only a problem if it's a problem for our teens. Raising awareness isn't necessarily going to help them, but when they do genuinely have a problem, how do we support that? So let's look at what generally an adolescent brain views as threats. Now, this is because of the stages of its development that it's going through, and going back to that original slide of the primitive mind, apologies, and the intellectual mind. A child starts at a very young age, almost from birth, with the primitive mind working. It's there to ensure survival. So if they're hungry, they cry. If they're cold, they cry. They've got that survival instinct there and working. And that intellectual mind is a work in progress. We could argue that maybe it continues to be, but if you imagine the intellectual mind a little bit like a library, as we get older and as we move through adolescence, we are learning more things and gaining more knowledge, which helps us to maintain some rationale of the primitive mind, but it's still very much a work in progress, and they are still very much dictated to by the primitive response. And these can be some of the threats that the brain views as a threat, as well as our children and what they have been learning and what they've picked up culturally. So perfectionism. Now there's from a survival point of view, getting things right actually could make the difference between life or death. But we find that those that are striving for perfection often have more activity going on in that primitive mind, because trying to reach perfection is pretty difficult, and there are lots of problems associated with that. The brain doesn't like isolation when it's in its adolescent phase, and actually not many brains like it for a long period of time. Our brains like to communicate with one another, and as we're going through our adolescent phase, isolation can be viewed as a huge threat. If you think about maybe many David Attenborough films, if an animal, a young animal, is on its own rather than with the pack, it's far more vulnerable. And our human brains still believe that to be the case. So this last year, with enforced isolation, has been a perceived threat to our adolescents' brains without actually any conscious thinking at all. They then become threatened by feeling that they don't fit in and judgment of others, of their tribe. They can also create threats through poor diet, because the brain can become threatened if it's feeling that it's being malnourished and not getting the nutrients and the hydration and the food that it needs. We then see our children comparing themselves physically to perfection, whatever that is. Being away from parents and home. Now, that obviously hasn't been an issue over the last period of time, but then going back to school, it was a really big change, and many struggled with that. Interestingly, in talking to many of my clients, a lot of them have worried about us parents. Going back to school raised a huge amount of anxiety for many of our children, in that they thought that they were potentially going to be putting us oldies at risk. So they worried a lot, and that maintained a lot of negativity and a lot of activity in that primitive response. Change, unexpected things. Well, we've all been there, haven't we? We've seen the slightly weird behaviour of bulk buying of loo rolls when lockdown first came through, and that was us adults. An unexpected change, a threat. Our primitive minds took over, our intellects were impaired, and we found ourselves doing many things that in reflection we might not have done, but we wanted to do the same as everybody else, and we needed to feel that we were exerting a control over this very, very strange, unexpected situation that we found ourselves in. Our adolescents can also feel very intimidated by those in positions of authority and the dictated or expected actions that are thrown at them that they have no time to actually think about. A problem's only a problem if it's a problem, as we know, and lack of sleep. And I'm going to talk about sleep in a little bit more detail as we go through, but when we are tired, we are vulnerable. When we're vulnerable, the brain perceives that as a threat. And so that primitive mind is active. So if you think about this last year with COVID, my goodness, they've lost their tribe, they've lost their purpose, they lost their expected future. They've, to date, all they've known is go to school, study for exams, and that's what you need to do. And the whole thing was changed. So whereas us oldies had a little bit more life experience to maintain some balance, our children didn't have that. As I say, they were fearful for the health of themselves and loved ones. Everything that they knew was changed overnight. And that really was massive for them. I don't think they realised that, but it was massive. And I recently was lucky enough to sit through a talk that was given by an ex-SAS soldier, and he said that one of the first things the SAS do when they've got their trainees come in is remove all boundaries. They remove any sense of time, they remove any sense of routine, they remove all structure, because they know that that evokes the most stressful experience for us humans. No boundaries, no structure, no routine, all of those things evoke a huge stress response in us. And our children have experienced that. And actually, in many cases, done extraordinarily well over this last period. But it's taken its toll. And an example of this that I just share is I had a client many years ago, a retired gentleman who'd had an extraordinarily prosperous and successful career, so much so I had to Google him just to find out who he was. But amazing gentleman who came to me for anxiety because he had retired, and upon retirement, his anxieties had gone through the roof, and he really didn't understand why. And it was because he'd lost his sense of purpose, he'd lost his structure, he'd lost his routine, and he was really, really struggling until we realized that we just need to reinstall those boundaries again. And he was able to go on and enjoy this retirement that he'd worked his entire life for. So very quickly, looking at the stress response, when the primitive mind, our chimp, becomes active with a problem, certain things happen. So in that primitive mind, we have something called our amygdala, which is constantly on the lookout for the next problem. We have our hypothalamus, which regulates all of the chemical responses in our body and mind. And we also have a part of our something in there called our hippocampus, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail later. But the minute we perceive a problem, the hypothalamus is activated. It then in turn activates the pituitary gland, which fuels adrenaline and activates the adrenal gland. And we find that our body, through our kidneys, has a huge amount of adrenaline and then consequently cortisol searing through our system, getting us ready to run faster than we've ever run before, or fighting whatever the problem is that comes our way. So stress comes in many forms. Stress, I'm sure probably everybody can relate to in some shape or form. Stress is that feeling of being under too much mental or emotional pressure. And pressure turns into stress when you feel unable to cope with it. And we've all got different ways of reacting to that, haven't we? So a situation for one person may not be a negative for someone else. You know, exams for our adolescents is a good case in point. Some children thrive under the stress of exams, feeling motivated and absolutely fueled, whereas others completely lose it and have a complete panic and a meltdown. So stress is a huge word that can be used in very many different ways. And as I say here, stress is not always bad. Stress can be a good thing if it's momentary, appropriate, and useful. And it's learned. It's one of those things that we have taught our children to be. Children, I apologize, to be. Let's put that in there. So adolescence, the adolescent brain, goodness, I can't speak, is changing all the time and is led and driven by this survival of the fittest. It's tribal, it wants to be included, it wants to fit in and not stand out. It's risk-taking. There are individuals within that tribe who are striving to be the next leaders. They're the ones that will take the risks. They're the ones that want to demonstrate their ability to survive those extreme situations. The brain is driven, as I said, with this tribal instinct to feel that safety in numbers is better. So if we don't fit in with the majority, we can feel very vulnerable subconsciously because it's just a problem to the brain. Adolescent brain is on a different circadian rhythm to us adults. It wants a different body clock. Again, that's part of evolutionary survival instinct, in that our adolescents would stay up later to watch the tribe's animals and to keep the tribe safe whilst us oldies slept. Within this, they're also encouraging themselves to test themselves for independence, wanting to move away from the family home, but equally needing to know that that family environment is still there. Now, that doesn't mean a family of two parents. It just means somewhere safe that they know is there, that they can go back to. So this primitive mind is dominant when our children are going through adolescence. As they develop, as I said earlier, their intellect, they find that they're able to start to take back a control that hasn't actually been there very much at all. But understanding the primitive chimp brain is key. Our chimp is entirely negative. It will always see the worst case scenario. Going back to that ferocious animal that's hunting us down, we can't assume there's only one. We have to assume there's more. So we're going to be looking for all the other ferocious animals that could possibly be causing us a problem. It's also obsessional. It wants to know exactly where all of those ferocious animals are so that we can be guarded and so that we can be prepared. So it wants to start to bring in an element of control. That's where OCD and obsessive behaviors can come in. It's the primitive mind, it's our chimp trying to bring some sense of control to a situation that we feel very much out of control. Bulk buying of loo rolls, for example. It's constantly vigilant, so it's always on the lookout for the next ferocious bear. It's not going to sleep. It needs to look for anything and everything, so it's always going to be looking for problems. And because it's not an intellect, it doesn't think like we do, and this is really important to recognize. It works on a very, very simple, well, it's not quite so simple, but it works on the basis of pattern matching. If what ensured your survival yesterday worked, i.e. you're still here, you will be encouraged to do the same again. So that could be feeling anxious, sick, not being able to swallow, having a panic attack, abstaining from food, eating too much food, any response that the negative chimp brain has dictated in a state of crisis will be laid down for future reference, and then we'll be encouraged to do the same again. And the more we repeat the same behavior, the more we lay down a dominant pathway, and it becomes quicker and easier to fuel that pattern match. And that could be also feeling incredibly low, depressed, and wanting to retreat to the back of our cave, or i.e. our bed and under our duvet. So how do we create anxiety? Well, we create anxiety and this activity in the primitive response by having a negative thought, something that we're not happy about, a shock to the system, or I don't like that, or I wish that hadn't happened. Anything negative evokes a response from that chimp-like brain. So this is where we can start to see that some of the behaviors that our teens demonstrate actually aren't as a direct response to that external world. They are because the primitive chimp has started to respond to a moment in time or a thought from that external world, and then the behaviors that he or she dictates to us become more of the problem than the root cause of the problem ourselves. So it's not the events in our lives that cause this perception of crisis, it's the way we choose to think about them. And that takes us back to what I was saying earlier about lockdown. For some, it was the dream come true. And trust me, over the years, I have a question that I ask many of my clients, which is, if a miracle happened, what would be better? I can't tell you the number of children over the years that have said, well, no school. And until recently, I've always had to say, okay, well, I get that, but within the realms of what's possible for us, what could we be looking at? Because going to school was just something that happened. And then look what happened. We didn't go to school. So for some of those children, it was a dream come true. Whereas I'm sure you could relate to those of you that had children who were very happy and achieving and doing well in the school system, participating in activities and all of the things that were keeping them happy and functioning. For those individuals, when lockdown happened, very, very different response. So our brains can't differentiate between our imagination and our reality, and that can cause an awful lot of problems for us, because we'll often find that we're creating problems based upon our thoughts of something that's happened in the past, which we can't go back and change, and it's already happened, but in thinking about it, we're fueling that same response again. And then consequently, because it happened in the past, we then find ourselves imagining the worst case scenario that could happen in the future. So why is that relevant? Well, this simple analogy here will help to tie it all together, you'll be pleased to hear. We all have a stress bucket. Some have huge ones, some have small ones, and you'll recognize that because some people seem to be able to deal with an awful lot of negativity and stuff before they lose it, and others seem to have a very, very short fuse and low threshold. And that's to do with how much stress they are carrying and operating with at any one time. So all of us with COVID and the uncertainty and the change got quite a lot dumped in our bucket quite ceremoniously overnight, because all of us faced an uncertain future. You could argue that we're still in that state of crisis. There's still a lot of unknowns, there's still threats, there's still things going on out there which would be highly appropriate in loading our bucket. But then we have to remember him. He is entirely negative. So long as he's been activated for whatever reason, he then helps to load that bucket system even more. And this is where we get stuck, because the more that there is in the bucket, the more active he is, the more active he is, the more that goes in the bucket. So we can find ourselves in a very, very tight, self-fulfilling prophecy of negativity, anxiety, anger, depression. And actually, we can't actually remember why. And we don't need to know why. We just need to understand that this is what's happening. So when it comes to the bucket, we have two things that we have got control over. One, and this is where I come in a lot of the time with my clients. One is I help my clients to recognize what they are thinking. Are you thinking negatively, or are you able to challenge that and start to flip things so that you can anticipate a more positive future? And in doing that, we start to limit what's going in the bucket. Also, we've obviously got a lot in the bucket, so we have to recognize how it empties itself. So when we sleep at night, when we dream, our bucket naturally will empty. There are some caveats to that. I don't know if you've ever experienced waking between the hours of 1 and 5, maybe, with your to-do list or whatever's bothering you going through your mind. That's a clear indicator that your bucket is too full and that your brain can't process what's going on. Conversely, you might find with our teens that they're more likely, not always, but they're more likely to be led to actually wanting to sleep more. Now, that again is an indicator that there's too much in the bucket, and that the REM phase, so the dream phase of our sleep, is slightly out of kilter. REM is exhausting. And if we are depressed or on the lower end, i.e. hiding from the world, and we are serotonin deficient, the REM phase, so the bucket emptying phase, doesn't work very well. So you are encouraged to sleep more. And the more you sleep, the more exhausted you feel. So you just get permanently stuck in this feeling of utter exhaustion. You can even wake feeling more exhausted than when you went to sleep, because the brain is frantically trying to empty the bucket and bring things back under control. But in doing so, is actually rendering itself pretty useless and exhausted. So it's just a factor to recognize that if you're oversleeping or undersleeping, it's not helping to regulate the levels in the bucket. So brain development in the adolescent brain affects daytime and sleep. Adolescents will normally sleep, as I said, slightly later in the evening through to earlier in the day. So up until the age of 10, most children awake feeling refreshed and energetic. And we know that it's usually far too early, isn't it? In adolescence, the brain's biological clock or circadian rhythm shifts forward. The melatonin secretions, which trigger our sleepy feelings, start later in the night and turn off later in the morning. So this natural shift peps up adolescents at the traditional weekday bedtime of 9 or 10, and this explains why it can then be harder for them to wake up in the morning. So in contrast, the circadian rhythm of those of us in middle age tends to swing backwards, with many of us struggling to stay awake when our adolescent children are at their most alert. So I know I can relate to that. Teenagers actually need as much sleep or even more as they got when they were children. 9 to 10 hours can be optimum. Most adolescents are chronically sleep deprived. And as I mentioned earlier, that is a threat, and that activates the activity in the primitive mind. So part of the blame can be placed on the early starting time of schools, which, coupled with many teens 11 o'clock plus bedtimes, you can see how they're running on a permanent self-fueling deficit. Too little sleep can result in uncontrolled napping, either in class or if they're a little bit older, when they're driving, irritability, anxieties, and depression, for the reasons we've looked at earlier, because poor sleep or tiredness activates that primitive mind into helping us. We then start to find that we drink more caffeine drinks, which kind of messes up the circadian rhythm even more. So sleep debt also has a powerful effect on our teens' ability to learn and retain new materials, especially in those abstract subject areas as physics, philosophy, maths, and calculus, things that we expect them to be able to learn in school. So battling biology can be daunting, but adults can help teenagers get enough sleep by keeping TVs, electronic gadgets out of their bedrooms. Yeah, I'm going to try. Switching to caffeine-free drinks, and getting them to wind down at least an hour before they're expecting to go to sleep. And that also can be difficult because many of our teens like to become active and do activities in the early evening, which fuels endorphins and feel-good factors, which is great, but it then makes it harder for them to switch off in time to go to sleep. So catching up with sleep at the weekends isn't necessarily a good idea, because it actually confuses the brain, which likes to have a really nice regular routine when it comes to sleep. And as adults, we may also be able to relate to this. We can actually create what's called a sleep hangover by having too much sleep at the weekend and sleeping in, and making us feel even worse than if we'd woken up at our usual time. So, as we saw in that video right at the beginning, a lot happens when our teens sleep. So not only are they trying to regulate their emotions, there's an awful lot of other work going on, laying down memories, getting rid of some memories, lots of physical growth and development. So sleep is pretty important, but at the moment, very much something that we are all deficient in. And I read not long ago that even us adults are sleeping on average 2 hours less a night than our parents did 60 years ago. So maybe we all need to sleep a little more. So REM is the process that helps to remove the emotions during sleep, and that's quite important. As I said, the REM phase can help us to regulate those emotions, but if we've got too much in our bucket, we can find that we wake up in REM, or if we don't have enough serotonin, or if we're feeling depressed, we can find that actually that REM is defunct and we don't get enough of that. So rapid eye movement, REM, that is our brain's way of de-emotionalizing those worries that we carry. So the physiological side of what's going on in our brain is that actually we need certain neurotransmitters to enable us to lay down new memories, to enable us to regulate our emotions, to enable us to feel good. And if we have too many things going on, that hypothalamus pumping out far too many chemicals, adrenalines, etc., we can find that we can be quite anxious and wired and ready to run. Or if we are suppressing those because we're going to hide instead, we can find ourselves feeling quite low and depressed. So I said that I'd mention a little bit on enhancing performance, because it all sounds like it's pretty negative, and it's hopefully what you're going to see throughout this is that actually through understanding we can recognize our children's behaviors, and instead of viewing it as a problem for ourselves and igniting our chimps activity and two chimps going at it, I'm sure you've all experienced that, I know I have, that's not a good place to be, because angry, upset emotions, and actually what for? It's usually just because we've got two chimps going and we've lost our intellectual control. But on the positive, some of these things can be used to help us to enhance our performance. And I won't talk about it too much, but I just wanted to throw in something that's really positive. So closing your eyes for a few minutes each day and visualizing what you want to achieve can literally change that day, and your expectations of it. So it helps us to stop that negative fueling. We can start to break those negative loops by tricking the brain into thinking that what we are visualizing is actually real. And you'll remember we talked about the brain's inability to differentiate between imagination and reality. We can actually trigger physical changes that alter the way that we think and behave. So through visualization alone, we're rewiring our brain's system. We're creating new neural pathways. And that activates our reticular activating system. Now, you'll be aware of this in operation, in that if you've bought yourself a new pair of shoes or a new car or something that's branded, you have heightened your awareness to that thing. And through the reticular activating system, you will see more and more and more of that same thing over and over again. It's what our marketing departments rely upon. So it thrives on positive thinking and responds to repetition, imagery, and emotion that our own choice of positive visualization can provide. So the more we feed it, the quicker we'll find when we can react, resetting ourselves and breaking down those negative spirals and creating our preferred futures. Because visualization has further power to physically change our brain. There's a great experiment that was conducted by a gentleman by the name of Alvaro Pascal Leone, who he took groups of volunteers to practice a 5-fingered piano exercise for 2 hours every day for 5 days. After a week, daily tests showed that the areas of the motor cortex devoted to finger movement had expanded like dandelions spread on the lawn. However, he didn't stop there. He extended the experiment to another group, asking them to merely think about practicing, not actually physically doing so. And the test data showed that the motor cortex had expanded in exactly the same way, proving that mental practice has the same effect as physical practice. There was more recently a program done by Dr. Michael Mosey that proved this too. So visualization combines both these elements, enabling you to become driven by that positive anticipated future. And that in turn creates more of the same and exercises your intellect and calms that primitive response. So bear that in mind, and you can help your children to anticipate a positive future. So I teach the teams that I work with a specific exercise called Swish to help them if they're feeling particularly anxious. I'd be very happy to take you through that if you contact me. It allows us to harness the power of anxiety and to use it as a tool to enhance our performance, to run faster, focus quicker. And this is where there's a huge difference in appropriate momentary activation of the primitive system, a raising of anxiety, a raising of anger, all these things, but then abates when it's no longer needed, rather than this chronic self-fueling, self-perpetuating negativity that causes us so many problems. We also look at the differences between anxiety and excitement, and there aren't any, other than the narrative that we associate to them. Anxiety is something that we are anticipating with a negative bias, and excitement is the opposite. It's something we look forward to, but it's an unknown, but we're expecting it to be good. So I take them through faking it. Fake it before you make it. How many times have we said that? Imagination versus reality. Use it. How is tomorrow going to be better? What's going to tell you tomorrow is going to be better? What would you like tomorrow to be like? We can then challenge the brain's defaults of negativity by changing our posture, so changing our physical being so that we can actually kid it into thinking that things are better than maybe they are. Breath work, looking at different ways of breathing, ways of calming that primitive activity. And as we've just looked at, positive visualization. So in 2003, the team, the Great Britain cycling team, hired a gentleman by the name of Dave Brailsford as their performance coach. You may be aware of this. They were pretty mediocre at best at that time and certainly weren't winning anything. In fact, some of the manufacturers that had supplied them actually stopped selling their bikes to them because they were fearful of negative publicity. Brailsford set about creating a 1% marginal gain. And one of the things he brought to the team was visualization exercises. In his words, it can be the difference that makes the difference at the top level of sport. So expecting small incremental gains and imagining them happening is key. So what can we do? Ultimately, as parents, we want to help our child keep the chimp quiet. We want them to feel safe. We want them to feel like they belong. We want them to have a sense of purpose and feel that they are satisfying their needs. So here are some little ideas that may help. So keeping busy, doing breath work. Now, I'm a great believer that you should do your breath work when you are calm, and in between problems, not at the time, because if our breath is elevated and someone says focus on your breathing, all you could potentially be doing is magnifying the problem. Focus on now, what's happening around you, so be more mindful. Cut out the negative introspection and the negative forecasting. Focus on the positives. Be organised, i.e. don't leave things that could be open to interpretation. Keep things clear, methodical and organised so that we know what is happening. Do more of what you enjoy. Create a routine around sleep, sticking to the same time, day in, day out. Eat nice food. Now, I say that, I use the word nice because what is healthy for one is not necessarily healthy for somebody else, but nutrition is key and hydration, but also food for enjoyment. So eat a variety of everything, basically. Help them to understand that failure is okay and encourage them to stick together, even if it's just with one other person. There is no doubt that evidence shows that if our teens find something that they feel passionate about making a difference to, a campaign or a good cause, that can fuel their feelings of well-being quite exponentially. So I'm an engineer at heart. Once upon a time, I like a good equation. So the equation for mentally healthy well-being is 3 P's plus P equals well-being. What that means is that the 3 P's plus P equals a nice steady flow of serotonin. And if we have a nice flow of serotonin in our brains, we feel okay and we can cope with things. So 3 P's are positive action. Choose to do something. Doesn't have to be big. It can be as much as getting out of bed. Choose to do something with somebody else, someone who makes us feel good. That's where we've been missing massively over this last year. Positively reflect on the previous 2 and have a purpose. If we have a sense of purpose, that's the final P. It's not as essential, but it makes the difference. That creates a nice, healthy flow of serotonin in our brain. And when we have a nice, healthy flow of serotonin in our brain, we can cope with whatever the world chooses to throw at us. So what can we do? The biggest one, and I've been guilty of this myself. I still am. I'm a parent. I care. We all care, don't we? But try not to fix things for them. We have to remember that our children are individuals and they have their own interpretation of their reality. Us wading in with our solutions to their problems can sometimes actually create more problems for them. Even though we're doing it with the best intentions, we want to help. We have to allow our children to find their own way and to empower themselves. Encourage distraction if they're in a state of crisis. Focus on anything else other than the problem. Don't ask them about it. Don't ask them to focus on the problem. Try and steer them away to a holiday that you went on some weeks ago, or some moment where everything was good. Love Island comes in quite well on that one, but please don't shoot me for that one. Try not to give direct suggestions, choosing to offer them a choice or a metaphor. How many of us have recognised if someone gives us a direct instruction, how much we don't like it? Although we like to have the boundaries and safety through understanding where they are. And that's one of the reasons that we've all struggled so much over this last year, because they've all been removed. Focus on what our children are good at, what they enjoy. Tell them it's okay to feel the way they do. Teach them self-compassion, lead by example, talk about how you feel if you want to. And get them to really start to use that power of imagination, which would have been there when they were younger, but we encourage our children to stop using it as they get older. But keep the power of imagination alive. What will be better when the problem's gone away? It's a great question. So remember, all of us, you're enough. It's really important that you put your oxygen mask on first as a parent. You have got to be okay. You have got to have your chimp under control and your bucket empty. I laugh at that. Like that's going to happen. But at least managing our buckets to the best of our ability so that we can regain our intellectual control when our children are struggling. There's nothing worse than having two chimps and stress buckets going at the same time. So take time for you, invest in what brings you joy and helps you to empty your bucket. And above all else, enjoy the moments in between. I hope you found this useful. Please do drop me a line if there's anything that you'd like more information on. I'm here and it would be a pleasure to answer any questions. Thank you so much and I hope it's been helpful.